Welcome back to Shameless Popery. I'm Joe Heschmeyer, and I presently plan to present a passage proving the papacy to Protestants. Now, I'm not going to pretend I was able to do that in one take, but I wanted to make sure I got that mouthful out for a good reason. A lot of non-Catholic Christians believe the entire doctrine of the papacy boils down to one passage and one part of a passage, that it's all about Matthew 16, and it's all about what it means when Jesus says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Now, I want to be clear. I think that is an important passage in proving the papacy. But, as I point out in my book, Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis, there's a better way to go to present the papacy if you're trying to explain this idea that may be very foreign to someone not coming from a Catholic background, using just biblical text. So let's start with why I wouldn't use Matthew 16, and then get into the passage I would use instead. So in Matthew 16, to give a little bit of context, Simon Peter declares Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And then literally it says, "And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you," singular here, "the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And so to hear many people tell it, both Catholics and non-Catholics, frankly, you would imagine that the entire doctrine of the papacy is only defended on the basis of this short passage, or even more specifically, just on that line, "You are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church." Here's an example of the way I hear it presented, that whether this is what the speakers mean or not, gives the impression that it's all just about this passage, that the entire doctrine of the papacy is hinging on these few verses.
The doctrine of apostolic succession is based on Matthew 16, 13 to 20. This is Peter's confession of the identity of Jesus and Jesus' response, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it."
It has often been suggested that Peter is the foundation of the church. I'd have to say, if it were so, it would be a very wobbly building.
According to Roman teaching, Peter is the rock of Matthew 16, that Christ, in conferring a primacy upon Peter, intends this to be understood to apply to Peter's successors as well, and that hence Christ is, in this passage, instituting the office of Pope for the Christian church.
So that's actually the first thing I would point to and why I wouldn't start with Matthew 16, because many Protestants are under the impression that the entire doctrine of the papacy is only from Matthew 16. If they've ever heard Catholics describe the papacy, they've probably heard of this. And so it's led people like Dave Hunt, who is a fairly anti-Catholic and kind of unreliable author, to make the claim that today it is claimed that Christ's statement to Peter made him the first pope, the rock on which the one true church was built, and that the Pope's authority today and the Catholic religion over which he presides stands and falls upon that assertion. Now, I'll just say at the outset, this isn't true. That whatever you think is meant by the rock in Matthew 16, you can believe in the papacy or deny the papacy. The doctrine does not, in fact, exclusively turn on what we mean by "upon this rock." And so let's talk about that. Who or what is the rock of Matthew 16? This is the second reason I wouldn't start with this passage, is that it's kind of a complicated question. It's complicated in part on the Protestant side, because many Protestants are eager to affirm basically any interpretation other than the seemingly obvious one that the rock is Peter. So, for instance, here's Mike Winger.
Their case for their authority, that single pillar that holds up all the doctrine of the church. We declare it, therefore it's true. Well, that pillar is based on two passages. One is Matthew 16. We looked at that last week and showed that whatever it does teach, it certainly does not teach that Peter was the first pope.
So I call that the kind of anything but Peter exegesis. It's like, we know Catholics take this interpretation, so whatever it means, it just doesn't mean that. And there's actually a number of Protestants who make arguments like that. About 100 years ago, a very popular Protestant preacher and scholar, A.T. Robertson, Southern Baptist, he argues that it's not perfectly clear how Jesus means the figure to be applied. When he says, "Upon this rock I'll build my church," we don't really know what he means. And he says he could mean himself if he pointed to himself. That this rock could mean Jesus if he pointed to himself and that really crucial detail was just left off or something. Second, he says Jesus could mean Peter himself by this rock as the representative of the 12 and as confessing his faith in Christ. So he can be the rock as long as it's on behalf of all 12. Or third, he says, Jesus could mean the confession of trust made by Peter as the rock. So the confession could be Peter's confession, it could be all 12, or it could be Jesus. The one obvious reading that is excluded there, of course, is that the rock means Peter in some unique and special sort of way. That there's a reason that Simon has his name changed to Peter and not all 12. So I would just say at the outset, it's a complicated question to start with Matthew 16 because a lot of Protestants don't really know what they think the passage does mean. They just know what they think the passage doesn't mean. Or maybe they'll have a very particular idea. They're convinced it means Peter's confession of faith, or they're convinced the rock is Jesus. Doesn't matter that those two views, it's hard to see how they go together, but we'll acknowledge that because the other group of people who have sometimes confusing interpretations on this passage are the church fathers themselves. The early church fathers were open to a wide range of meanings to this passage. This is a strong point to make. If you think that the entire case for the papacy is going to be made or broken by getting the identity of the rock right, you should know that the early Christians took different interpretations and didn't seem to think it was super important which one was right. So I want to say at the outset here, there's sometimes a mythology around this, even among the well-educated, that the one interpretation the early Christians didn't really take, especially in the East, was that it was about Peter. So here's Pastor Jordan Cooper making this pretty common kind of historical error.
The way that Rome interprets this, and this is, by the way, not the way the earliest church fathers interpret this passage, which I think is very interesting. And there's reasons why the Eastern fathers particularly have never held to this interpretation of this particular passage.
So that's a little confusing, but it seems what he's saying is there's this Roman interpretation, and that's a common description of the interpretation of Peter as the rock, as the Roman view. That there's this Roman interpretation, but this wasn't taken by most of the church fathers or anyone in the East. And neither of those claims are true. So Edward Syczenski, who is actually an Orthodox, I believe, former Catholic. He's married to a Catholic. His kids, I know he's raising them Orthodox. He's said that in interviews before. So he's definitely not a Roman Catholic. He's Eastern Orthodox, not in union with the Pope, has a book called The Papacy and the Orthodox, in which he discusses all of the history of this. And so he lays out 4 of the ways Matthew 16 gets interpreted by the church fathers. That the early Christians used 4 different motifs or 4 different set of interpretations for what they understood the rock to mean. But when he talks about Peter as the rock, the so-called Roman view, he's very clear that the identification of Peter as the rock is hardly a Roman invention. It's a misnomer to call it the Roman view, because it isn't as if the bishops of Rome are just like the only ones saying this is about them. That rather, he says, it was probably the intention of St. Matthew. That the evangelist himself, contextually, it certainly seems as if what we're meant to be taking from this is that the rock is the guy whose name just got changed to rock. And he points out that this was a very early interpretation that we find people like Tertullian. And he also makes the point that contra later Orthodox polemicists, I would add contra later Lutheran pastors as well, the idea that Peter himself was a rock is certainly also part of the Eastern tradition. The idea that this is just a Western or just a Roman thing is flatly untrue. And so he cites to and quotes from both Tertullian, who I mentioned earlier, St. Cyprian of Carthage, St. Jerome, St. Hilary of Poitiers, St. Epiphanius, St. Aphrosaph the Persian, St. Basil the Great, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, all ranging from the 100s to the early 400s, all of whom in their writings refer to Peter as the rock upon whom the church is built. But here's the kicker. If that sounds like just a slam dunk for the Catholic interpretation, and I do think the Catholic interpretation here is right, you should know, as he points out, that many of these same people, Origen, Hilary, Jerome, Gregory of Nyssa, and Augustine, used different interpretations throughout their careers and didn't seem to think it had to be just Peter or just Peter's confession or just Jesus or just Peter on behalf of the apostles. They might go from one to the other, and even of the individual as one upon whom Jesus intends to build his church. So that's confusing, right? So again, if you're going to imagine that all of this is just going to be settled that Rome thinks it means Peter is the rock, and Protestants think it means Peter's not the rock, and if we can just settle that question, the whole debate will be over. It's not true. To really double down on this, I would cite you to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which, like the early Christians, understands this passage of having multiple plausible and accurate senses of interpretation. So, for instance, in paragraph 881, it says, "The Lord made Simon alone, whom he named Peter, the rock of his church." If that was all the Catechism says, you'd be like, okay, great. The Catholic view is that Peter and Peter alone is the rock. And in one sense, it's absolutely true. But it also says in paragraph 424, "On the rock of this faith confessed by Peter, Christ built his church." So is it Peter or is it his confession? Yes. The Catechism is going to affirm both of those things. So if you have the idea that we just have to sort out which one is right, the Catechism is like, well, they're both right. And in fact, in paragraph 552, it harmonizes the two, saying, because of the faith he confessed, Peter will remain the unshakable rock of the church. But in that same paragraph, it also describes Christ as the living stone. So who's the rock? Is it Peter? Is it his confession? Is it Jesus Christ? Yes, to all of those. All of the above. So if that wasn't confusing enough, let's talk about the rest of Matthew 16 just for a second. Hopefully you can see why I don't start with this if I'm talking to someone who is not familiar with the papacy or this is all new to them. That's a confusing amount. You've got this confusing passage coupled with the fact that the early Christians interpreted it in sometimes seemingly incompatible ways and didn't seem to think there was anything confusing or contradictory about that. But then the other thing is, by honing in just on the "on this rock I'll build my church" part of Matthew 16, you're actually leaving aside this tremendously beautiful, rich passage that has a lot to say about the papacy. Just imagine that "you are Peter and on this rock" wasn't there. You would still have Jesus addressing Simon by name, Simon Bar-Jonah, and then telling him that he's going to build his church and will give to him personally, you singular, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and then telling him whatever you, again singular, addressed to Peter, whatever Peter binds on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever Peter looses on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So this raises three more interpretive questions for us. Number one, what does he mean by the keys of the kingdom? Now, if you want to do a deep dive on this, you can do places like Isaiah 22. You can look to Eliakim when he's given the key of the house of David as a symbol of this royal and priestly authority. Second, what does Jesus mean by this idea of binding and loosening? What is that all about? And to make it even more confusing, 2 chapters later, he's going to talk about what you do when you have an issue and you take it, you have a brother sinning against you, you take it to him, you bring 1 or 2 witnesses with you, and then if he still won't listen, you take it to the church. Something bigger than you, something bigger than 2 or 3 gathered in his name. And the church adjudicates the matter. And if he still won't listen to the church, he's to be treated as a Gentile and tax collector. And so we're told, whatever you, now it's collective, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, broadly speaking, there's 2 ways of reading that. One is this Catholic way, that this authority of binding and loosening, this authority of adjudicating disputes and settling theological matters and all of this is given to Peter in his individual capacity as Pope and to the church collectively. But there's a popular Protestant view that basically what was originally given to Peter 2 chapters later is given to everybody in such a way that Peter no longer has any special authority. So does Matthew 18 then render Matthew 16 redundant? Why does he bother to give a special authority to Peter if it's not going to be special 2 verses later? He just has special premier access? And what's meant by binding and loosening? Many Protestants will say it's simply the power to declare that Christ has won, the power to proclaim the gospel, which is not something that Jesus needed to give Peter because everyone can do that. You don't even need to be Christian to proclaim the gospel. You could accurately summarize theology without it. So my point here, hopefully, is to say, I think this passage is very rich, but maybe too rich as a starter course. That there's so much here that if you begin with this, you're likely to simply overwhelm the person you're speaking to. And I hope I haven't done that to you. I'm trying to flag these things, not trying to sort through and adjudicate all of them. But even in this, I'm aware this might be feeling kind of topsy-turvy. So how about a much cleaner, simpler kind of starter? And that would be Luke chapter 22. Now, Luke 22, this image of starters, kind of works because it takes place at the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, there's so much going on. Jesus institutes the Eucharist. He announces the inauguration of the new covenant. Judas is betraying him. He's giving his final discourses. All of these most important teachings he seems to have saved for this final night. And what are the apostles doing during this? Well, in verse 24, we're told that they're arguing about which of them is to be regarded as the greatest. Now, I respect Jesus' tremendous reserve here, because I think it would be very tempting to upend the tables and just say, I've been with you so long, and this is what you're talking about on our last night together? But he doesn't do that at all. In fact, he doesn't even just tell them to get back on track. He meets them at their level, and he talks to them about what it means to be great. And so, beginning in verse 25, he talks about what greatness doesn't look like. That we don't want Christian leadership and Christian greatness to look like the kind of overlords of the Gentiles who exercise lordship over the people that they've been entrusted with. He says, not so with you. Instead, he lays out a model of servant leadership. Now, that's really jargony these days, but he literally says that the leader is as one who serves. So, in the church, there are going to be leaders. That's good. This is not a mistake. This is not just egoism or pride. There are supposed to be leaders. But leaders have particular things they're called to, namely service. And Jesus gives himself as the model. He says, I am among you as one who serves. That's verses 25 to 27. Immediately, he then singles out the 12. And he says in 28 to 30, you are those who've been with me in my trials, as my Father appointed a kingdom for me. So I appoint for you that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So there is leadership in the church. It is apostolic leadership in its origins. We see it with the 12. We have 12 clearly identified leaders. One of them, as we know, Judas, is going to be replaced with Matthias. But they're still going to maintain this structure of leadership in the church. And then in the very next verse, you know what he does? He turns to one of the 12. If you're just talking about servant leadership and highlighting the servant leadership of all 12, he singles one of the 12 out. I bet you can guess which one. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. Now, you need to know here, you there is plural. It's you all. It's you 12. And we know the context, right? All of them are going to abandon or betray Jesus in some way. Judas is going to turn Jesus in. The other 11 are going to run away. Simon Peter is going to deny Jesus 3 times. It's going to be a pretty sorry night for everyone involved here. And Jesus knows this is about to happen. He knows they're going to undergo this demonic temptation, this sort of sifting like wheat. Imagine like a pitchfork sifting through wheat. Not a nice image. And what does he say in response? Does he say, but I'm God, so I stop this from happening? Does he say, he desired to have all 12 of you, so I prayed for all 12 of you? He says nothing like this. He says something much stranger. He says, but I've prayed for you. And now here he switches. Satan desired to have you, plural, you 12, but I've prayed for you. Now it's singular. You, Simon Peter, that your faith may not fail. But he knows it will. He knows that he'll deny him 3 times. And so he adds, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brethren. Now, those 3 words, strengthen your brethren, get to the heart of the papacy. And we can identify it in a really simple 3-step process. Number 1, in Christ's kingdom, the leader is called to serve. We already saw that here in Luke 22. 2, all of the apostles are called to serve in the church and to serve the church. He says that quite explicitly as well, right? Number 3, St. Peter is called to serve even his brethren amongst the 12. When he says strengthen your brethren, contextually he's talking about the others who are being tempted by Satan that night, the other apostles. So you have all these leaders, and one of them is to be a servant leader to the other servant leaders. As Pope St. John Paul II explains, this is what it means to be called to be Pope. And he knows he was. In JP2's words, he says, the Pope's duty is a service to the church and to humanity. This is why since ancient times he has been known as Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. This is the model. The idea of the Pope is not someone needs to boss everyone around and kick everybody and get everybody in line. It's true, there are times the Pope has to exercise authority and really settle disputes, use that binding and loosening power, but most of his authority is to serve and to lead in the Christian, humble, serving sort of way. In the same way that, like, if you're trying to understand the idea of male headship from Scripture, looking at the kind of stereotypically macho, kind of overbearing jerk of a guy is not going to be the way you understand male headship in a Christian sense. Looking as Ephesians 5 says, to Christ laying down his life for his bride, the church, that's how you know what male headship in a biblical sense looks like. Well, so too here. The papacy is biblical, but our misconceptions about the papacy, our caricatures of the papacy, may not be biblical. And so what Luke 22 gives us is what the papacy is meant to look like and be exercised as. And so understood in that way is very clear. Now notice, you don't have to get into all of these complicated questions of what's meant by the keys of the kingdom, what's meant by the binding and loosening, what does this imagery of the rock mean? Why does Jesus change his name to Petros and not Petra? Or maybe he uses Kepha and not Kepha in Aramaic versus Greek. You don't need to do any of that stuff because it's just this simple. Christ creates servant leadership in the church. He puts 12 people in that role. He puts one in the role to serve the other servant leaders, and that is the birth of the papacy. One guy who will take care of the other ministers who are taking care of the whole church. And you might say, what would a Protestant say in response to that? And I don't know of a lot of great Protestant responses to this, because it's so clean and simple. But I know of some bad Protestant responses to this. So for instance, here's John MacArthur.
They also use a second passage, Luke 22:31. Luke 22:31, where Jesus says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. They say that is a sort of a declaration of his papal primacy. Boy, that is some stretch. He says, I'm turning you over to Satan, and your faith isn't going to totally fail, but you're going to deny me before the cock crows, he says in verse 34. But you're going to be restored. Strengthen your brothers. So they say here is the Great Commission to be the ultimate supreme strengthener, the Pope. Again, ludicrous interpretation of that text.
So MacArthur's take is basically this is ludicrous because Jesus is not praying for him that his faith won't fail. He's turning him over to Satan. But you can simply read the text and see that MacArthur is not telling you the truth about what it says. Jesus says, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Now, I realize MacArthur's view of predestination and free will and all of this precludes the idea that Jesus could want Peter's faith not to fail and still know that it will fail. Because in his view, if Jesus actually wants Peter's faith not to fail, it won't fail because he's a monergist. And so he has to say that even though Jesus says, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, what he really means is, I'm turning you over to Satan so that your faith will fail. As I say in my book, Pope Peter, these kind of responses are not very strong because you can simply read Luke 22 and see quite clearly that something is being given to Peter that's not being given to everyone else. Why doesn't he say to all of them, all of you are going to be tried, but I want you to strengthen one another? No, instead, he highlights Simon Peter and tells him to strengthen his brethren. So I would start there. Look, if you're having a conversation with someone who is not a Catholic about the papacy, it's probably not going to be a one conversation and everything sorted sort of event. It's probably not going to be one passage. But if you're looking to introduce the idea, I would suggest this is a better place to start because it's nice and simple. And then if you want to do the deep dive on Matthew 16, great, you can do that. Final thing, for those of you who made it all the way through the episode, if you'd like a copy of my book, Pope Peter, I got a special promo code from my coworkers. So if you put in the promo code, Pope Peter, all is one word, at shop.catholic.com, I think it's like a 25% discount. You'll have to find out yourself. That should be good on both the paperback and the digital copy of the book. So if you want more on this, I'm happy to do more episodes, but if you want to read it, you can pick up a copy for pretty cheap. For Shameless Popery, I'm Joe Heschmeyer. God bless you.